This conference is on what's going on at the post office and Staples, and we have some very important contributions that are going to be made here about the history of privatization, who's involved, and also the proposal for a public bank at the U.S. Post Office, which would be a way of helping not only the post office and the post office workers, but helping the poor people of the United States that don't have access to banking, which is very important, particularly for homeless people, people who can't get a checking account. This is a critical issue. But we're going to start off with a postal worker, retired postal worker, Jimmy Kelly, who is with the San Jose Labor Studies program, and he'll talk maybe a little bit about the comedy night that they're having in San Jose with Will Durst. It's been advertised on KPFA, so welcome, Jimmy Kelly.
I'm a letter carrier at branch 1427 for 27 years and retired 5. But I'm still active, and wanted to sing you a couple songs about the post office. But first I want to do a Woody Guthrie piece. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking with the union. I'm sticking with the union. I'm sticking with the union. Oh no, you can't scare me, I'm sticking with the union. I'm sticking with the union till the day I die. That's from Union Maids. Woody Guthrie would be, I think, 102 tomorrow. So happy birthday, Woody Guthrie. And I'm going to do another song that Woody Guthrie sang about the mail. He sang a lot of songs, and this one's, he actually did children's songs too. You may not know, but this is one he did called Mail Myself to You. Well, I'm gonna wrap myself in paper, I'm gonna dab myself with glue, stick some stamps on top of my head, I'm gonna mail myself to you. I'm gonna tie me up in red strings, I'm gonna tie blue ribbons too. I'm gonna climb up in my mailbox, I'm gonna mail myself to you. When you see me in your mailbox, cut the string and let me out. Pour me full of ice cream sodas and stick some bubble gum in my mouth. I'm gonna wrap myself with paper, I'm gonna dab myself with glue, stick some stamps on top of my head. I'm gonna mail myself to you. Take me out of my wrapping paper, wash stamps up off my head. Pour me full of ice cream sodas and put me into a nice warm bed. I'm gonna wrap myself with paper, I'm gonna dab myself with glue, stick some stamps on top of my head. I'm gonna mail myself to you. A little bit of nostalgia about the post office. There's a lot of songs about the post office, and Melvina Reynolds wrote one too. She actually wrote a kind of a blues song called Mailman Blues. So I changed it to Carrier Blues to kind of make it more gender neutral. Here comes the carriers that love to see them on their way. Well, here comes the carriers that love to see them on their way. Well, what kind of goodies do they bring in their bag today? Well, here comes a carrier with the hair and beads. Must have been Haiti asked for a carrier. Well, here comes a carrier with the hair and beads. Well, what they got this morning, everything a good guy gal needs. Well, the bag's on his shoulder, full of God knows what. Well, the bag's on the shoulder, full of God knows what. Well, my paycheck isn't heavy, but the junk weighs an awful lot. Bag on his shoulders, what's in there, heaven knows. The bag's on the shoulder, what's in there, heaven knows. I got a letter from the tax man, the bill for my one-eyed clothes. Well, the bag's on the shoulder, it weighs to carry it down. Well, the bag's on the shoulder, weighs to carry it down. And the story in the Chronicle tells well how the world come they blame the mess on you? Good morning, postal workers, how come they blame the mess on you? They cut off all your money, now you gotta do the work of two. Well, there's a lot of talking and talking about the economy. Well, there's a lot of talk, they talk about the economy. Well, they'll cut down on the mail force, give hands out to AT&T, and I'm not talking about the park over here either. Well, they're talking in the Chronicle, they're talking in the Mercury News. Well, they're talking in the Chronicle, they're talking in the Mercury News. Well, the talk is mighty heavy, that's why we got the carrier blues. Well, here comes the carriers, I love to see them on their way. Well, here comes the carriers, I love to see them on their way. What kind of goodies do they bring in their bags today? Smell Beaner Reynolds? This is why a post worker up in Canada wrote, I can't remember who it was, but the line goes, no contracting out. It's our turn to fight this time. No contracting out. Brothers, sisters holding the line. So that's the chorus if you want to join me. No contracting out. Our turn to fight this time. No contracting out. Brothers, sisters holding the line. This the kind of postal services wants to take our jobs away. Low wages and no contract, and we'll fight for equal pay. We say no contracting out. I turn the fight this time. No contracting out. Brothers, sisters, hold the line. All across this country, working people are being attacked. They want to lower our standards and to set our wages back. There'll be no kind of quality if they get what they're about. And no union contracts if all the work contracted out. We say no contracting out. I turn the fight this time. No contracting out. Brothers, sisters, hold the line. Okay.
First of all, I want to say that there's some very good news, and that is, for the first time, really, the postal workers' unions have been invited to join with the National Education Association and the AFT at both their conventions. And they had a rally yesterday at Staples. The AFT ended their convention in the afternoon, joined in protest at Staples in Los Angeles. And at both conventions, both unions, NEA and AFT, have said they're going to join with this campaign against Staples and against privatization. I think UPWA, United Public Workers for Action, has been calling for a national political education campaign against privatization, not only at the post office, but in education in all areas, because there's a whole scale onslaught against public workers and public services. And the unions who have millions of workers, the AFL-CIO, SEIU, NEA, AFT, AFSCME, need to put their resources together and begin a national political education campaign against privatization of the post office and all public services. In Canada, the Canadian Union of Public Employees has a campaign against privatization of education and their services. We need the same thing in the United States desperately to fight these union busters and billionaires. And speaking of billionaires, there's some billionaires behind what's going on at the privatization of the post office. And one of the persons that's I would say a billionaire buster, at least he's going after the billionaires, is our next speaker. His name is Peter Byrne. He's an investigative journalist, and he's written a book, Going Postal, which is really about the billionaires who are behind stealing our public services and looting the post office. And what I believe, and he'll talk about it, is that we need a campaign not only to expose them, these criminals who are really looting our public services, but to put them in prison and to prosecute them and put them in jail. That's where they belong. You know, we need to put them in jail. So, and I think when the labor movement begins to take that up politically, then you'll have a changing dynamic that you're not going to get away with it. So welcome, Peter Byrne.
So it's war on the workers, you know, been going on for a long time, and every once in a while it breaks out into bombing and bullets and napalm and all that. But, you know, it's not like it's not going on when they're not actively shooting people. I was up in Santa Rosa yesterday. I live up in Petaluma, and took my 11-year-old son to a rally for Andy Lopez, who a 13-year-old boy who was shot down by a sheriff recently back from Iraq. Last October, the DA refused to indict him, saying that he thought that he was in danger, so he was entitled to shoot this young lad who was in a lot in the middle of the afternoon with a toy gun. And, you know, my son, like, he didn't want to go, but when he was there, he really, you know, started chanting and he listened to what people had to say, and there was people who'd just come back from Palestine talking about the murder of children over there. And, you know, I didn't want to depress him by bringing him to 2 political events in a row, especially because he likes ones that have lots of people. I took him to one when he was about 4, you know, it was like a vigil or something like that, and he goes, "Daddy, I don't think there's very many people here." And that's the problem, you know, we need to mobilize people with information so that people know where we've come from and where we need to go, and information is so vital, and the media, the corporate media, the main goal is to spread disinformation and to disempower people by feeding them lies and keeping them focused on their iBooks and iPads and I. So last September, I published a investigation of the sale of post offices funded by the investigative fund of the William James Foundation in Santa Cruz and some other individuals. And I published a synopsis of it in the East Bay Express, and I did an e-book called Going Postal under my own imprint, which I'm going to keep going, called Burn Inc., I-N-K. And it's kind of cool because you can get the ebook for $2.99 on Amazon, and it has links in it to all the documents, the thousands of pages of documents that support the analysis and the facts presented in the book, which is a wonderful thing, actually, because, you know, you can use the new tools in journalism to our advantage, because they present a medium in which you don't have to take a reporter's word for anything anymore. You know, say, show us the facts, show us the interview, or whatever. Now, it's interesting because people that are mobilizing around the post office tend to be a little bit older than, say, my 11-year-old son, to put it mildly. And they tend not to like Kindles and ebooks and things like that. So they actually asked me to make a print-on-demand version, which I did. And that's selling more right now than the ebook, which is actually better because it's got color and stuff like that. Pardon me. But what happened after it was came out last September was it got picked up to a little bit in some of the mainstream corporate media. It didn't get authenticized in a lot of people's mind until the LA Times mentioned it favorably, and then the Huffington Post jumped on that and wrote an interesting article which kind of laid it out in terms of what was being presented, that U.S. Senator Diane Feinstein's husband sells post offices to his friends cheap. And, but interestingly enough, the head of the Washington Bureau of the Huffington Post, some Witterer fellow, made a little video to go along with the perfectly fine article that had been written by one of his journalists, in which he said, "Oh, the post office, who cares about the post office? That's just so yesterday." And you know, a lot of people believe that. They believe two things that aren't true. One, they believe that it's broke, which it's not, and two, they believe that it's so yesterday. And like, just to set some things straight, which I researched when I was doing this book, and which is presented in it with proof. Yes, there was a downturn in the use of the U.S. first-class mail for paying bills and writing letters with the advent of email and the internet. But it was more than made up for by the vast flood of packages that were started to flow through the post office. And, you know, first-class stamps have been subsidizing advertising junk mail for years and years and years. So people have it upside down. If you want to actually make the post office into a super profit, then just charge the cost of actually mailing advertising to the corporations that mail the stuff. You know, that would go a long way. The other thing is that the post office, of course, is one of the major unions in the United States. It was a union that was one of the first to include African Americans and women, and the current long-term, well, several decades old, you know, ever since Reagan pretty much, or even before, thrust to privatize the public commons. If they can take down the post office, it's going to have a pretty big victory for the Koch brothers and their friends. And the media is completely complicit in this. They keep repeating these lies that come out of bureaucratic mouths like Patrick O'Donoghue saying that we're broke and, you know, we need to sell off our real estate in order to get back into the black. You know, and those are lies, and that leads me to the thesis of this book, which, interestingly enough, when I undertook the project, which I didn't want to do because I'm sick of these people, in 2007 I did a big expose of Senator Diane Feinstein and her husband's military construction businesses. She basically steered through a subcommittee that she ran in the Senate, $1.5 billion worth of business to her husband's companies. And that actually had a pretty big impact. Interestingly enough, not because the liberals or the progressives liked it, because they didn't, because they have this like image of Feinstein as being some kind of liberal hero, and she's actually a neocon. I don't understand it, but it's psychological. It's like people like Obama, they think that he's some kind of liberal too or something, and you know, he's to their right of both Bushes, you know, arguably. So at any rate, and then a couple years later, this man over here to my right, Brechin, convinced me to expose how the University of California's endowment funds were interpenetrating with Richard Blum's banking business, which I did, and you know, that got a fair amount of attention. But you know, then when Gray and some others came to me asking me to look at the post office, I was thinking, well, you know, third time is like, you know, maybe they'll kill me if I do it this time, you know. But they didn't. So I went into the project thinking, since I knew that CBRE, which is a corporation, is the largest commercial real estate company in the world, was until recently chaired by Richard Blum, who's the husband of Senator Diane Feinstein. And to digress for a second, let me be explicit that Feinstein and Blum have collaborated for 3 decades now to loot the public treasury for their family business, and that's well documented by myself and others. I figured that since CBRE had this contract to be the real estate broker for all these post offices that have been put up for sale around the country, that they would probably be selling them for more than they're worth, because that would give them a bigger commission. But what I discovered was somewhat counterintuitive. I discovered that they were selling them for far, far less than they were worth to their friends and to themselves in various real estate partnerships in which they were involved, which actually did make a lot more sense, because that's the way this, you know, these private companies game the system. You know, arguably the entire government is a committee set up by, let's call it the ruling class or the bourgeoisie, to distribute the public wealth to themselves. And what was going on here was that first, the selling of the post offices was undertaken under the false premise that the post office was broke and going broke. We all probably know the tale of how Congress mandated that the Postal Service prepay $55 billion worth of retirement health care benefits in 10 years, a burden that is put upon no other agency, in which no business in the world would contemplate, thereby driving it $5.5 billion into the red immediately. it hasn't really been able to pay it. It borrowed $15 billion to pay it so far, and monetize everything it could lay its hands on, and it hasn't been able to pay it, and eventually probably, you know, hopefully it will be, mandate will be overturned, but it has, in the meantime, given a lot of credence to Darrell Issa and these other troglodytes who think that, you know, the post office should be made more efficient by selling it, right? So the Blum-Feinstein axis, which is a wonderful partnership, you know, to steal Matt Taibbi's wonderful phrase, they're a vampire squid family, you know? I suppose that, I don't know which is the vampire and which is the squid, but the mating process must be interesting. So what they did was, CBRE had contracts to sell and manage real estate for the post office for many years. A lot of the post office's management tasks and also delivery of mail, almost everything except putting it in your mailbox, which is a federal, you know, mandate that only the Postal Service carrier can put it in your mailbox. Everything else can be outsourced and has been outsourced. FedEx is the largest private contractor of the post office. Private companies deliver mail to U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. They truck it, you know, all over the place. You know, it largely has already been expropriated, and they want to give it the coup de grace and take it over completely. So part of the monetizing of it was to find real estate that could be privatized. And next to the military, the U.S. Postal Service is the largest owner of real estate in America. Of course, it makes sense. They not only have nice post offices with murals in them, but they have huge warehouses and parking lots and buildings that are used or not used, some of which should be sold all over the country. Millions and millions of square feet, and I think the portfolio is valued at around $85 billion. What happened was that in 2011, basically a sole source contract was given to Blum-Feinstein's family corporation. It's a publicly owned corporation, but you know, most of the people on the board of directors are cronies of Blum's or ex-business partners or current business partners. And it was done secretly, and it was done without following the normal rules for, you know, competitive bidding and stuff like that. They emerged with the sole source contract to sell and manage all of the post office's real estate. And I was able to obtain using the Freedom of Information Act, which hopefully will still be with us in years to come, even though it's been eviscerated by Obama. The contracts themselves and a list of the post offices that have been sold by CBRE for the first 2 years of the contract, including who it was sold to, what the address was, and how much, even though the spreadsheet they gave me was full of errors. It was a beginning. They would not give me the appraisals of the post offices. Appraisal is an assessment of how much property is worth, its current fair market value, claiming that it was a national security secret. So that really pissed me off, and I decided to really dig deep, and so I went either online or by telephone. There was 55 properties that had been sold, and I went to the assessor's office for every single one of those 55 different counties. It was very time-consuming and laborious, but you know, I like to do that sort of thing, being kind of OCD. And I obtained the actual assessed value of each one of these properties and more information, you know, maps and things like that. And this pattern of like 85% of them having been sold for under their assessed values emerged, which is really strange and against the contract that they had, because the contract required them on no uncertain terms to sell these post offices at or above fair market value, and they were doing the opposite. And then through additional research, I was able to ascertain that more than 50% of these properties have been, I think, sold to companies that already were clients of CBRE or that were engaged in real estate partnerships. I'll just tell you a couple of the most egregious ones. In Boston, there's this redevelopment district called the Seaport District, which CBRE is one of the partners in the real estate firm that, partnership that is managing the transformation there. And they sold basically to themselves a piece of land that was central to redeveloping it. I think it had been assessed 20 years previously at about $12.5 million. They sold it to themselves for $10 million. It was probably worth $100 million. And Goldman Sachs was part of that. You know, they were making hay off of that, the original vampire squid. Goldman Sachs, by the way, owns slightly more of CBRE than Blum owns. So, you know, if you want to keep digging, Blum, you know, actually is kind of dwarfed by Goldman Sachs, just about everything. And they call a lot of shots in these instances. In Las Vegas, the post office sold some really beautiful land in the Strip to under CBRE's sponsorship for $1 million an acre, and then the person that bought it turned it around and sold it for $3.5 million an acre. The person that bought it was a client of CBRE. The list goes on and on and on. It's all laid out in the book, which you can buy from me for $10 or get online for $2.99. It's nice, it's fun to read. It's got exposés of the Blum-Feinstein axis, and it talks about every single one of those properties in the back and has the proof and stuff like that. The chapter on the Blum and Diane and Feinstein's family business is called Die-Fi and the Blumpire, which, you know, it's my attempt at humor. And to make a long story short, it caused a stir for a bit of a while. You know, I did a lot of radio shows and even some TV and stuff like that. CBRE put out a statement saying that Byrne didn't understand the real estate business. I guess I do understand it. Feinstein's office put out their typical disclaimer, which is basically the senator and her husband do not discuss his holdings. Actually, they're her holdings too. If you believe her economic disclosure statement, which she files, has all of his holdings. That's how we know what the family's holdings are, is from her economic disclosure statement. And just, this is an interesting factoid. Her statement typically runs 200 to 250 pages. Jay Rockefeller's statement is 8 pages. So, you know, talk about a vampire squid, they're all over the world, you know, and what better, you know, method of keeping people out of your business than to have the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee as your business partner and spouse. So, you know, it got a little play for a little while, but actually what was really interesting that happened was that the U.S. Inspector, the Post Office Inspector General did get involved. They must have bought a number of copies of it because they basically did their work for them. And they embarked on a series of audits of the contract. The first one came out, I think it was in April, in which they said that the practices CBRE has of representing the post office in real estate transactions while representing the buyers is inadmissible, unprofessional, and needs to be abrogated immediately. To which Tom Samra, the multi-millionaire man who's in charge of the real estate facilities division of the U.S. Postal Service, replied, "No, it's standard business practice and we're not going to stop because I guess you can't stop us because everybody knows that," he didn't say this, but we really know that unless you want the Intelligence Committee breathing up your ass, you know, you better back off, you know, whatever. So the Inspector General tends to be, you know, like all of them, pretty cowardly and politically motivated, and, you know, they basically like to attack low-level employees and put them in prison, but anybody above like GS-14 is pretty much usually golden. However, in this case, the sale of these properties at under their fair market values, it was such an egregious violation of the contract that they actually do seem to be digging deeper. I know they've been interviewing people about it, and perhaps they'll come out with a report that says that what we already know is going on. Whether it will recommend criminal prosecutions, which they have the power to do, is another question. But if, as Steve said, we were ever to get to the point where we could demand justice for all, then there would be prosecutions of billionaires and corporations and Congress people and senators that are paid, you minions. And I've laid out in this book a blueprint for an indictment. It's all there. Any attorney general or district attorney or investigative reporter, anybody that actually wants to find out what's going on, just has to read this because it's laid out with supporting documents. There's never been a request by anybody to correct a single fact in the entire thing because every one of them is true. And it's a question, therefore, I guess, of political will. So we'll see what happens when the Inspector General comes out with their investigation of whether or not these properties were sold under fair market value. But I suspect what will happen is that they'll kind of waffle. They'll say, yes, there were some instances, but they said that they will do what? I don't know what they're going to say because it's already happened. Were they going to give back the money? No. By the way, the man that's in charge of negotiating all of the real estate contracts for the Postal Service, Mr. Tom Samra, I was able to obtain his economic disclosure form because the top postal officials have to file them every single year, and they're very interesting. He's the richest one in the whole place. He's worth as much as $90 million, and it's all kept in cash instruments. And he lives in a small house, a relatively small house in Vienna, Virginia, next to the Beltway, which you can see on Google Earth if you're interested. And he periodically takes trips on the stamp buyer's dime to Switzerland, flying first class for like overnight, to do things like, quote unquote, according to his expense report, have dinner with Swiss executive. You don't have to be a genius to see what he's doing. So it's a completely corrupted, little corner of our completely corrupted system. And, I don't know what it's going to take personally for people to wake up to what's going on. I mean, I think that the Facebookization of everybody has really impacted people's ability to see what's going on around them, because what they're doing is their endorphins are being manipulated and they're being sucked into this great brainwashing machine that tells them what to think, and they call it freedom.
For me, all this began, well, I'm the founder of the Living New Deal Project. There's some cards back there if you want to find out or become part of it. And what the Living New Deal does is to inventory for the first time and map the whole physical legacy that the New Deal left us, and in the process to prove that, in fact, the reactionaries' lies, which I believe has been repeated by our president, that the New Deal didn't end the Depression, the war did, is a lie. Because in fact it did end the Depression. It was very effective. It would have been even more effective if they had been larger. But it's left stuff all around us that we use all the time without knowing it or linking it with the Roosevelts and the people that they gathered around them. And among those are the post offices. So I got involved in this about 2 years ago. I became aware that our historic post offices with the art in them were being sold off. I did an article on the downtown Modesto post office, which is a beautiful building with New Deal murals in it, had been sold off. Against the wishes of the businessmen downtown, because what happens when these central post offices are sold off is that they will then lease space in a storefront in a strip mall on the outskirts of town to make it as inconvenient as possible to do the services, and also to just take the business. I mean, the struggling downtowns need all the help they can get, and a post office is a place that brings people together and attracts people downtown. So this is going on all over the country. And so I did an article for The Guardian, and then I gave a talk about 2 years ago that Peter filmed actually at the Hillside Club over in Berkeley, illustrated with slides about what we're losing. And it galvanized. I mean, there was a standing room only audience, and it just galvanized them because nobody knew this was happening. And I could show these beautiful buildings and the wonderful art that's just, we're losing it. And I made the point, why are we doing that? I mean, because we own it. My parents paid for it. We own it. And so out of that grew 3 organizations that I know of. One, the Save Berkeley Post Office, which fights to save the post office. Another group, Berkeley Post Office Defense, which actually did a sit-in, a camp-in on the steps of the post office, the downtown post office, because our Berkeley Post Office went up for sale soon after all of this started, and it's a beautiful building too, 100 years old, with 2 New Deal works of art in it. And then the National Post Office Collaborate, which is the legal arm, which I'm going to talk about later on. One other anecdote, about a year ago I was taking the Metroliner from New York to DC, and I wanted to stop off for the night and see a friend in Philly. So I got off at the train station. I had previously photographed the main Philadelphia post office, which is right across Market Street from the train station. So I thought, I've got a few minutes to kill. I'll go over there and photograph the lobby. It's a beautiful lobby. I'd photographed it before. I wanted to see it again. I walk over, I walk up, and there's a guard at the door, and he said, "You can't go in here." No, he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I want to just photograph the lobby." And he said, "You can't do that." I said, "Why? It's a post office." He said, "No, it's private now." I said, "What? We paid for this, you know?" He said, "No, it's private now." I said, "You know, they're taking everything away from us." And he said, "Yeah, I know they are. Now get out of here, we're going to arrest you." So I did a little research on that. I found that that was actually sold in 2007. It's a colossal building, occupying at least a full city block. And so I found out that the post office sold it in 2007 to the University of Pennsylvania for a meager $51 million. It's worth a great deal more than that. And then they flipped it to a developer for, I think it was less than $51 million. And then he leases it back to the IRS for a very handsome profit. And so it's now a private building, though occupied by a government agency. So this is the kind of stuff that's going on all around the place that Peter's written about so well. I'm also involved in what's happening to public education. We were on a panel last week on that, and especially at the University of California, which I've been at for nearly 50 years. And so I read this remarkable statement by Andrew O'Hare. He wrote an article. He's the film critic for the Salon magazine. And there was a 4-hour documentary by Frederick Wiseman that was actually broadcast on Channel 9, I think it was, well, a few months ago, called At Berkeley. And it's a documentary. It's an odd documentary if you can get through the 4 hours of it, because you can project anything you want to on it, as far as I'm concerned. People say that they've sussed out his political bent on it. I don't think so. I think I know what it is, but you can do anything with it. So anyway, Andrew O'Hare, whose father was a professor of Celtic studies at Cal when it still had a strong humanities department before it went profit generation strong, he wrote this wonderful essay. It's a review of At Berkeley, and he wrote this. This is how it winds up. At Berkeley is both a work of social observation and a work of philosophy. Wiseman has always been acutely sensitive to hierarchies of power. And it definitely isn't just a story about Berkeley or about higher education. He got it. One of the greatest acts of neoliberal hypnosis over the past 40 years has been convincing almost everyone in mainstream politics, conservatives and liberals alike, that it was both fiscally prudent and morally necessary to subject the entire public sphere to market forces. It was neither prudent nor necessary. It was a vicious and misguided political decision rooted in a quasi-religious dogma that sought to imprint the values of the market on every aspect of society, and it has largely succeeded. It was led by those who despised the communitarian values represented by the public sphere, and I should say the Roosevelts, and it longed to banish them, and abetted by those who went along because they didn't want to look like wimps. It has poisoned our future. It hasn't just poisoned our future, it's poisoned our present, and often quite literally in the terms of what's happening to the atmosphere, the oceans, the rivers, everything else. It has quite literally, our food supply, it has quite literally poisoned everything. but it's absolutely ubiquitous. And so what's happening to the postal office and the postal system is just a part of the much larger picture about how they've, as Peter said, colonized our minds. And Facebook is so useful in doing that. How is it, what's going on at Cal? Just as a sidebar. When Dick Blum was appointed regent, he's the alpha regent at the university, 12 years ago, I mean, he really has kind of dictatorial sway over the other regents, and they're no gems. He was appointed by Gray Davis because he's a nominal Democrat and married to a nominal Democrat. As he told the Chronicle in 2007, he was spending every waking moment of his life restructuring the University of California. Now, he has no educational experience to do this, but he feels that UC is basically just a large corporation that needs restructuring, and he knows how to do it because he's so rich. So the first thing he did was to fire President Dines, apparently at a lunch in Emeryville, and bring in President Udoff from Texas, where he has extensive business interests, Blum does. He brought that man in, and then he didn't have to spend all of his time restructuring the university because he had a sock puppet to do it for him, Udoff. And Udoff brought in all these very high-paid executives with MBAs who don't have any experience in education, and they've been very successfully basically restructuring the university that I know. So that on the surface, if you're not critical, you look at it, it looks kind of the same, but it is almost an entirely different institution at this point. But that wasn't enough itself. Udoff stayed on for 5 years, then decided to retire. Then they did a job search to find out somebody else. And they, as the Chronicle said, they thought out of the box. And I'm sure, again, this was Blum, because he was on the committee doing the search. They announced one week that they were going to hire Janet Napolitano, the head of Homeland Security, to be the president of the University of California, good friends with Joe Arpaio down when she was governor of Arizona as well, too. They were going to bring in the head of Homeland Security to run the University of California. They announced that one week. It was confirmed the next week. It was in the dead of the summer so that nobody, the faculty, the students had no say in it at all, making a hash of shared governance with the faculty. But it doesn't matter because the faculty is with the program now. There was almost no protest about it or understanding of what it means to have the head of Homeland Security as the president of the foremost public university in the country, which has been, ever since the Manhattan Project at least, completely tied in with the military-industrial academic complex. So Janet Napolitano now runs it with no protest whatsoever. And why would that be? Well, as Peter said, Blum's wife happens to be head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, who has called Edward Snowden a traitor and that he should come back and face the music. And she's all in favor of complete surveillance unless it's her office. So do you think that Janet Napolitano, as head of Homeland Security, is a stranger to the Blums' 5 or 6 mansions, like their huge ranch in Aspen, Colorado, that Peter found some wonderful stuff on? Maybe he'll talk about that later on. The what is it? Black bear?
Black paw.
Black paw?
Bear paw.
Bear paw. Up in Sinclair, called the University of California, the University of the Black Hand. So this is appropriate. It's in places like that that the Blum Feinsteins had people of immense power, whether political or financial. We don't get invited to those places, but they have them. And this is the way that power perpetuates itself in a corrupt would-be democracy such as ours. So the interesting thing about that is about what's happening at the post office and the university was summed up in a recent article by Paul Krugman. But how can you justify enriching the already wealthy while making life harder for those struggling to get by? The answer is you need an economic theory claiming that such a policy is the key to prosperity for all. So supply-side economics fills the need backed by lots of money, and the fact that it keeps failing doesn't matter. That's the mark of religion. The neoliberalism, free market fundamentalism, keeps failing spectacularly over and over again, and they keep trying more of it. Obviously they haven't done enough. Now, a few other articles that just came in. Royal Mail, this is in The Guardian, Royal Mail sale underpriced by $1 billion, says scathing Select Committee report. The Royal Mail, 500 years old, was sold off by the Cameron government recently, and it's turning out, as they look at it, it's an incredible scandal. They sold it off for a fraction of what it was worth, and that includes, as it says, 3 major properties in the City of London, which were wildly underpriced. The taxpayer didn't get their money's worth. So it's turning out to be just as corrupt as what's going on here. The Harper government in Canada is doing exactly the same. I just got an article about Harper's plan to completely privatize Canada Post, and they will sell off the post offices, the real estate as well too. Let's see. I've just written an op-ed that I'm going to submit to the New York Times. I don't expect it'll get in because the media in this country has done a spectacular job of ignoring what's going on. I mean, when I first heard that Blum's company had gotten the exclusive contract to sell our property, my head just exploded. And this was 2 years ago. And ever since, I've been trying to get the media, including the New York Times and Bill Moyers and Amy Goodman, who won't even respond to me. Screw Amy Goodman. I've just had it with her. I mean, you know, it's not a... I mean, I sent it on university letterhead. I mean, you know, no response. So anyway...
send it from Indonesia.
Yeah, that would do it.
Or the Pope.
We'll send it from wherever that place was. And speaking of media, I mean, it's completely with the program. So another thing Peter didn't tell you is when he did his last big investigative report on Blum's enormous investments in the sleazy for-profit colleges, the Chronicle, Nanette Asimov, she was working with Peter on that. They lawyered it for 8 months while Blum threatened to sue the Chronicle for libel if they ever published it, and eventually they spiked it, as one would expect. And the city editor at that time, Audrey Cooper, who was responsible for that as far as we could tell, is now managing editor of the Chronicle. So, you know, you will never get in the Chronicle any indication of just what's going on with Blum Feinstein. Last week I was talking with a friend of mine. She's a very wise Pacific Heights matron who knows her way around San Francisco society. And I just brought up the name Diane Feinstein, and without any prompting, she said, she's so corrupt. It's known. It's known in her circles how corrupt Feinstein is, but nobody's going to move against her, especially because of the power of her husband. So, just to wrap up, I'm on the board of the National Post Office Collaborate, and there are letters in the back with donation envelopes. This is the legal arm, and we've had amazing success. We stopped the post office dead when they tried to sell the Stamford, Connecticut post office, 100 years old, doesn't have New Deal art in it, but they tried to sell that, and we stopped them dead in federal court. The judge agreed with us. Basically they said, you know, the Postal Service is just ignoring the law. And so we really stuck a broomstick into their bicycle wheel and stopped them dead. But what they're going to do is try to keep appealing it so that they can bankrupt us, because we just have to raise money, and Berkeley's been carrying so much of the burden. The Los Angeles Times did an article about how Berkeley is the epicenter of resistance around the country to these corrupt sales. But Berkeley can't do it alone. The unions, I must say, I'm ashamed of the unions. We've been fighting their battle for them, and with the exception of APWU, which made a one-time donation to us, we haven't heard anything from the unions about what's going on, nor the preservationists, like the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which has deep pockets. We haven't gotten anything from them. So if you've got any ideas, we've got to pay our legal fines, or basically this suit is at an end. And because it has to go beyond that. As Peter said, the Office of Inspector General is starting to dig into this. He wouldn't have done that without Peter's article. nor would the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation come out to Oakland and taken testimony about what's going on. None of that would have happened without what Peter did and what NPOC, the National Post Office Collaborative, is doing. So what we really need to do is not just try to save the post offices. We need a full-scale criminal investigation of what is going on. I've said it before, I'm going to say it again. What we're looking at is the teapot dome of the 21st century. We have got the most powerful senator in the Senate personally profiting through community property from the sale of public property. This is very much like what happened during the 1920s with the illicit leases of public oil lands by the Secretary of the Interior and various other people high in government. But at that time, we actually still had a legal system. Albert Fall was sent to prison on that, and others were as well. It just doesn't happen anymore. So we've got to try to get it back, and we've got to get a real criminal investigation of what's happening. And in that process, hopefully we'll be able to save hundreds of thousands of living wage jobs as well, too. One last thing. When Postmaster General Donahoe wrote to Mayor Bates last year about why they had to sell the Berkeley Post Office, he literally boasted that they had gotten rid of 193,000 postal jobs up to that date. It just continues. 193,000 living wage jobs they got rid of in the midst of a recession. That's unconscionable. Okay, thanks very much.
I work with Bank Act, which is an organization that came out of the Public Banking Institute. And we've been working very closely, actually, thanks to Dave Welsh, who's our next speaker, with the unions for 2 years now to try to get public banks in the post offices. And it's a win-win, win-win, several other win situations. It's a win for the post offices because it will increase their business and hopefully keep jobs and even increase jobs. It's a win for the communities because it can replace, a post office bank can replace the check cashing places, which are totally predatory and evil. The interest rates they charge amount to 500%, which is hardly imaginable, but that is in fact. And sometimes it can get to be more, because what happens is people borrow a small sum, have 2 weeks to pay it back, don't meet that, then the interest starts piling up and it gets extended, they roll over that small sum and it gets bigger and bigger, and in some cases it can go up to 1,000% interest. These check cashing places are backed by the big Wall Street banks, the same vampire squids. That Goldman's, most of the check cashing places, the big chains, have lines, open lines of credit at the big banks. That's how they finance all these small loans. So postal banks will be a win for the communities, especially poor people. 1 in 4 people don't have a bank account. And I don't know if you've tried to rent a car lately without a credit card or without a bank account. There are many things you simply cannot do in our society without a bank account. So aside from the fact that people are racking up huge interest rates, there are also many other things they just aren't permitted to do without a bank account. So this would provide banking for the people who need it the most in our country. I think the biggest political problem right now is the fact that the Postmaster General, Donohue, is totally opposed to keeping the post offices open. That seems like a problem to me when the CEO is committed to closing down his business. You'd think there'd have to be some change. It turns out that not only is Donohue the second highest paid person in our government after Obama, but he's also it's essentially a lifetime appointment. So the political source of his power is the Board of Governors. there are 5 vacancies on the Board of Governors right now. And 4 of the 5 that Obama has proposed are terrible. I mean, truly awful. The only one is a Kennedy, and she would presumably be pretty good. But we need to get to Congress to get them to tell Obama to withdraw 4 of the 5 nominations and replace those 4 with decent people, people who will support keeping the post office open. What a radical idea. And I'm not quite sure how to do that, but that's a campaign that we need to put together. Going back to the unions, and we're working very closely with the 2 biggest unions, but I don't think they're doing anywhere near enough either. It took protests on the street by Strike Debt and others in Berkeley in front of Staples to get the unions to begin to protest against Staples. And there's now an ongoing presence on Shattuck Street in Berkeley. It also took the sit-in, the month-long camp-in occupation of the Berkeley Post Office to slow that whole process of selling it down. So this couldn't be a more grassroots organization protest, but it needs union support. When I sent Peter's article to my contacts in the union, they sent it to the Postmaster General. They didn't make a fuss about it. Not the Postmaster General, I'm sorry, the Inspector General. But they didn't make a fuss about it themselves. You would have thought that it would just be so juicy and right for them to make a big deal of, and they haven't done that, which is a shame, I think.
When you say they, who are you referring to?
The unions.
Okay.
They haven't been anywhere near as aggressive as they need to be if they want to stay alive. I mean, this is, the post office is our oldest government institution. It was around, it was begun by Franklin before we even had a constitution, before we had a government. It is incredibly democratic. Everyone gets served. There's no, you don't have to pay a fee for better service if you're rich. It needs to be, it's part of our commons, and it needs to be preserved. It is more than just, it's a huge symbol, but it's more than just a symbol. It is a service that we desperately need. So we need a commitment from everyone engaged, from the whole labor movement, to keeping the post offices open. And the public banking piece of it is a step in the door to beginning to take power away from Wall Street. It would be the first, after the Bank of North Dakota, which has been around for 100 years, this would be the first public bank in 100 years. And it is worth fighting for that. I don't think it even will take an act of Congress, since they're already engaged in money orders. And did public banking until 1967. You could open a savings account at a post office until 1967, when Wall Street closed it down, that piece of it.
Doesn't North Dakota have a public?
They do.
So there's one. Is that the only one?
That's the only one. Well, there's one on an Indian reservation, but it's very, very small. But it's essentially the Bank of North Dakota. That's the only sample we have.
It's very successful.
Very successful. Sailed through the recession. So recently, our victories have been a measure passed, two resolutions passed at the U.S. Conference of Mayors 2 weeks ago. One calling on mayors to ban the check cashing payday loan places as soon as there's a replacement, because they're necessary. They are serving a huge need. They're serving it extremely badly, but they're needed. Something is needed. And we need to replace them with postal banks and then shut them down. That was one resolution that was passed unanimously. The other was suggesting that when mayors support postal banking, it will come back in spades because we can use the savings accounts that people will file with start with the postal banks to start an infrastructure bank, which can be devoted to municipal infrastructure. So those two measures, which seem pretty duh to me, were supported at the mayor's conference 2 weeks ago. And yesterday, the executive committee of the California Democratic Party is meeting in Oakland this weekend, and the resolutions committee passed a resolution supporting postal banks. So it has to pass the whole body, which should happen today. And if that passes, that's another big piece. California is the biggest state in the union. So what the California Democratic Party says should have an effect in Washington.
Thank you for this opportunity to talk about the post office and saving it. There's a couple of pieces of literature that on the back table, which I'd like to call your attention to. One is a flyer about the campaign of the American Postal Workers Union against the staple stores, which have established postal counters where you can go there just like you go to the post office to take care of your postal business, except instead of being handled by a postal employee who is a uniformed postal employee who has taken the oath of office and to safeguard the sanctity of the mail, it's being handled by a minimum wage employee, often part-time and temporary, working for. Now, we have nothing against those workers. I'll put it down there. We have nothing against those workers. We need to organize them and get them a living wage. But we don't want to destroy the post office in the process. We want to keep the post office, which, as others have said, is a service that's been around for 239 years, before the country was even created. And the second thing back there is a newsletter, the current newsletter of Communities and Postal Workers United, which is a network of activists around the country that's fighting to stop the privatization of the post office. The third thing is an article by myself called Grassroots Action to Defend the Post Office. And this, there's a powerful movement that's underway, actually. We shouldn't be pessimistic because it's underway to stop the privatization of the Postal Service. I think there was one very important event in the history of the Post Office. The unions have been around since the National Association of Letter Carriers, my union, has been around since the 1880s. But it was an association. It didn't have collective bargaining. It was just to represent the people. And it did fight for the people as best it could, but it had no power. It didn't have the power of a union, really. Then the other major union is the American Postal Workers Union. There's also the mail handlers and the rural carriers. Now, in 1970, postal work was very poorly paid. It was a poverty-level job, as some of you know, who worked in the post office at that time. And it was the time of the Vietnam War, and there was a time of great dissent and a great popular upsurge. And you had returning Vietnam veterans who were very angry at being used in that miserable war. And there was a ferment going on in the country. And it was also a time when you could say, if you wanted to, you could say, take this job and shove it and then go across the street and get another job. That's not really exactly the situation today. So there were some things that were very favorable to the strike, because in 1970, the letter carriers decided to go on strike because they were getting such miserable pay offers. They had, at that time, something called collective begging. They went to the Congress, and they said, we are good workers and we deserve better and you should help us out, So that strike shut down the mail in the entire country for a week. In some places, it was more than a week. And that shook the foundation. I mean, that because the carriers and the other postal workers honored the picket lines and often walked the picket lines. So that was a tremendous display of the power of the workers, and it cost business a lot of money. So that made a big difference. And out of that, we got collective bargaining. And that's why the postal work is a living wage job today. And it's what we want for all workers. We want it. And it's going to take this kind of an action. I'm not saying this specific type of action because the situation is different. But this kind of mass action with the grassroots involving community support is what it's going to take to raise up the wage level of the workers in this country. Now, when Reagan took office as president, one of his first acts was to bust the Air Traffic Controllers Union, PATCO. Some of you may remember that. And that began a 3-decade-long decline in the standard of living of the workers in this country. Not just air traffic, all workers suffered as a result. The letter carriers were able to hold up because we had a full cost of living. So as the Vietnam War inflation raged, we were able to stay up pretty well. That's why it's a living wage job today. They haven't been able to destroy it. That's why they're out to destroy it right now. What they would want, the post office is the largest unionized employer in the country, and Walmart is the largest private employer, period, in the country. And what these privatizers would like to do is to reduce postal work to Walmart wages. That's what they want. That's what they want. And they want to bust the union. They don't want these uppity unions telling them what to do, So now they have a bigger target, the Postal Service. So the grassroots action, I won't go on too long here because the other speakers have very ably discussed the overall situation. But I do want to point out some fight back that is going on. From the very beginning, as soon as they announced that there were going to be these draconian cuts, Postmaster General Donahoe announced these draconian cuts. Hundreds of thousands of workers laid off, post offices closed, shut half the mail processing plants, and that kind of thing. So there was immediate struggle, like for instance in New York, in Harlem, the South Bronx, Staten Island, Co-op City and Chelsea neighborhoods, among others. There was a struggle to save the post offices, and they were often successful. In fact, I happened to be in New York when one of these was going on, and there's a place called University Station. It's a postal station in Harlem, and they were going to close it down, but it was essential to the community. I mean, everybody there used it. And if you didn't have it, you have to take buses, the L, everything. You'd have to, if you were disabled, if you're elderly or something like that, it'd be a real hardship, because people depend on the post office. Especially people who don't have much money, they can't afford to go to FedEx and pay, or UPS, United Parcel, and pay higher fees for it, So there was this group called the National Action Network, and they have a youth, and they have an office there in Harlem, and they have a youth arm. And the leader of this youth arm was a 15-year-old girl named Victoria Pannell. And she led this march. And inside the post office, I joined them. We went there, we occupied this post office, and we said to the clerks that were behind the counter, listen, we don't want to stop people from using the post office. We want people to use it. So they would go and they would tell the post office, you go right up to the counter, and the post office, the clerks behind the counter were leading cheers in solidarity with people occupying the post office. So in San Francisco, we had a similar thing where they announced that they were going to close 4 post offices. Three of them were in the southeast section of the city: Bayview, Visitation Valley, and McLaren Station. All very needed by the community.
Of course.
Yeah, and so they were going to close down these because the criterion that they used was it making a profit? You know the way that corporate executives will go in and they will say, okay, we have 50 stores, let's take the stores that make the least profit and close them, you know? Well, that was the kind of attitude they had. They also were trying to remove collection boxes where you put your mail on, the blue boxes where you put your mail on the corner. And they were saying the boxes with the fewer letters we're going to remove. So it's the poor neighborhoods and the rural neighborhoods, which are also mostly poor also, that are being targeted. So basically their whole idea is we will keep the potentially profitable parts, you know, that we can make a profit off of, and the rest, forget it. You know, let the people fend for themselves. So anyway, we had this march of 200, and we marched to the Civic Center station, and it's in the Tenderloin, and it services a lot of people who don't have much money, people who are either homeless or they live in these SRO, single room occupancy hotels, or other places where the very poor live. And so they depend on their post office box or general delivery of the mail. So, so we had this march and had some great speeches. A letter carrier made a great speech at the federal building, and then we marched through the neighborhood and occupied the post office for about 2 hours. And we brought in our PA system, and we had a rally in there. And when it was over, the clerk there came out, took the microphone, and thanked us for being there, the uniformed clerk. Well, right after that, the post office took Civic Center Station off the closure list, took Bayview Visitation and McLaren off the closure list. Now, I don't know if it was because of the march, but the workers there think it was because of the march. So, then, for instance, in Portland, the activists blocked the scab trucks because they're trying to privatize the postal trucking. You know, they want these highway contract operators to. So they blocked the trucks, and they had these swarms of bicycles would go in front of the trucks, and had these creative tactics. And then in Arizona, they used a more conventional approach. They organized businesses and everything to meet with the Postmaster General and stop the closing of their mail processing plant. Let me just say something about the mail processing plants. In Maryland, Frederick, Maryland was one of the mail processing places there, and the other one was Baltimore. So they said, we're going to close Frederick and do it all in Baltimore. Well, you can't imagine the chaos. They found a tractor-trailer truck full of mail, and one of the postal workers let the local TV station into the truck to film it, to film the postmarks on that mail. And it was like 10 days old, 2 weeks old, first-class mail. That's just an example of what's going on. And they're trying to reduce the service standards so that instead of getting the mail. Still today, you can use, if you put something in the mailbox, first-class mail, and it's going to another urban area, even across the country, they'll probably get there in a day or two. You know, it's still true. So it's not destroyed yet, but they're working hard at it. Now, the Rural Organizing Project in Oregon wanted to stop the closing of post offices and also the reduction of hours of the post offices. And so they organized this return to sender system, you know, saying, we're going to return your plan to do this to sender, basically. So they've been very effective, you know, against all odds. They've been very effective. Then other coalitions, like I mentioned, the Communities and Postal Workers United, organized a 4-day hunger strike in Washington, D.C. Well, people thought letter carriers and other postal workers going on a hunger strike is kind of a strange thing. So we were able to break in the media for the first time, you know, the big media, you know, about these issues, instead of having it all dictated by the people who want to privatize. So that was very important. Earlier this year, there was a letter carrier killed in the Washington, D.C. area. He was murdered. He was delivering mail after dark. And so there was this uproar. There was this demonstration by postal workers and committee members in solidarity saying letter carriers should not be delivering mail after dark. And because it's become an epidemic, like every day you deliver the mail after dark. Every day. It's a routine thing during the winter. So why is this? Because the closing of these mail processing centers means that the mail gets there later. They move the starting times later. So it's a safety issue, but it's tied in with all these privatization efforts that they're doing. So we had this march, and then later on there was another march in Washington, D.C. from the Martin Luther King Memorial to the Postal Service headquarters of several hundred employees, including Tyson Barnett was the letter carrier who was murdered, including his family came all the way up from South Carolina to march and saying that no letter carrier should be out after dark delivering mail because it's dangerous. People have sidearms, they have shotguns, you know. This is a violent country, you know, and people shouldn't be subjected to that kind of thing. And it's mismanagement, deliberate mismanagement, privatization is all part of it. Then, and after that, all of a sudden, when there was this big public march in Washington, D.C., which was heavily covered by the media, all of a sudden the Postal Service started to say, oh, we don't want the people, and all that kind of thing, out after dark. They really haven't corrected the problem, but it got their attention in a big hurry. So the other thing was, in December 2012, Senator Joe Lieberman, I don't know if you know about that guy. Anyway, Senator Joe Lieberman and Darrell Issa, who's a representative from Southern California. You can boo freely, it's okay, you know. Yeah, cat calls are acceptable here. I can see with this crowd, so. But anyway, they said they're going to use the lame duck session of Congress to eliminate six-day delivery of the mail. So we in Committees and Postal Workers United set up a tent on the mall facing the Capitol with big banners saying save six-day delivery, and we had a hunger strike there. And then later we rented a horse-drawn carriage, you know, the kind of the tours that, you know, and we had this big, huge postcard saying safe, and we delivered it to took it to the White House to deliver it to President Obama. I don't know if that had any effect. Then we also had an occupation of Darrell Issa's office. We went in there, we occupied it, and we sang songs. We sang 6 days a week delivery to the tune of 8 days a week by the Beatles and other songs. And we basically said, well, we're not leaving until we talk to Darrell Issa. And they said, well, he's on the Hill with an important bill. And about 1 minute after they told us that, he bursts into the main part of his office, from his private office, and starts to debate us. And had a 20-minute debate with Darrell Issa. And anyway, so that was another thing. And then in Berkeley, it was mentioned that we had a 33-day occupation on the steps of the Berkeley Post Office with about 25 people every day for a month. And now, as Susan mentioned, there's a 24/7 occupation that's been going for 3 weeks at the Staples store at Shattuck in Berkeley. And it's an information table. It's a different kind of a thing than what we had at the post office. It was several people staying overnight. They're sleeping in their chairs. So they don't have tents and that kind of thing. And but it's very effective in chasing away customers from Staples. So they had one in San Francisco for 8 days. So there's a lot of creative tactics being done. And now the postal unions had a tremendous demonstration in 2011 in all 435 congressional districts. There was a demonstration about these cutbacks. So that was a powerful thing. After that, they kind of backed off and weren't really doing too much except lobbying. And then this year, we had a new leadership in the American Postal Workers Union. And this Staples flyer, they have this tremendous campaign around all the places where there's postal counters, so-called postal counters in Staples stores. There's a new leadership, and he was able to get the other postal unions to come together around something called a Postal Union Alliance, and he put forward the idea in which they'd all support each other's demands. Before that, they were kind of henpecking each other, and you know, there was people were taking a narrow, compartmentalized approach, only letter carrier issues, you know, and that kind of thing. But now it's changed. And now they're putting forward the idea of a grand alliance with the communities around the country. So it remains to be seen whether that's going to happen, but it's very hopeful. And this campaign about Staples is also very hopeful because one of the top executives of Staples said, we're going to have to reevaluate our relationship with the post office because we have to make sure it meets our corporate objectives. Because Staples, nobody's buying office supplies. You go into Staples stores, there's more employees than, I mean, even before the boycott, more Staples employees than there are customers. So they're closing 225 stores. So they're hoping this postal thing will be a lifeline for them and be able to pull their chestnuts out of the fire. But anyway, so that shows that they're worried by this boycott. So and now these other unions are taking, the teachers and other unions are taking this up, and they're saying, we're not going to buy any office supplies from our whole union, our whole national union, some of the biggest unions in the country, saying, we're not going to buy any more office supplies at your miserable store. So postal banking, I think it's a vibrant movement going here. It's just got to be spread more. And that's where you come in. So get involved, support the Staples boycott, pick up the literature at the back, and
Staples, and they have like a store locator, and you can find out which ones have post offices. It says USPS shipping services and stamps, same low USPS rates, convenient Staples hours, and 5% back in Staples rewards on shipping. I find that last part very interesting because that is essentially saying the post office has signed a contract that deliberately undercuts postal rates by 5%. And I suspect that's not legal. That's very interesting.
What comes with neoliberalism is normative corruption, where everything is on the market, and it's exactly what you would expect. I mean, you know, Grover Norquist's ideal of the way that the U.S. should be is the 1890s, the Gilded Age, as Mark Twain called it. And if you look back at that, I mean, it has to be 1890s because even Teddy Roosevelt was too far to the left for Grover Norquist because he instituted some reforms. So you want to go back to the ideal, which is the 1890s was a horrible decade because it was a horrible, almost decade of depression, and it was unbelievable corruption, which is what the novel The Gilded Age is all about. Anyway, so we're back to that now. 3 years ago, under my name, I submitted a petition of almost 300 people at the university asking Kamala Harris, the Attorney General, for an investigation of the charges that Peter had made about Blum's conflict of interest, Regent Blum's conflict of interest with for-profit colleges. And I submitted all the supporting documentation from Peter's report. We never heard a thing from them. I'm actually going to resubmit that and send it in by registered mail. And I'm going to copy as many people in the media as I know. But I just uncovered it the other day. I went, God, this was 3 years ago, you know? And so we're gonna do that. If we could get some union backing on that, or, you know, that would be wonderful. Because that's what happens. You try to get the Attorney General to do an investigation, and they ignore you. It's amazing. Oh, we did also, I also submitted it to the state auditor, because they also investigate things like this. I got one letter from them, so they did receive it. They said they would look into it, but it would be completely confidential, and I've never heard anything from them since then.
Blum has, over the years, last time I looked, he had, CalPERS gave him $500 million, that's $500 million to invest through his firm Blum Capital, and he invested all of it in stuff that he owned, like CBRE and the 2 for-profit colleges, ITT Educational Services and Career Education Services. Unfortunately for the public employees of this state, those investments are shit. And what people don't know, which I report in the book, is that Blum Capital is almost extinct. They've lost almost all their money in the last 3 years. CalPERS kicked him out. The city of Los Angeles kicked him out. Wilshire Consulting, which consults for all the major pension funds in the United States, tells all of his clients now not to hire Blum because they lose money. Because they invest in stuff in which they have a conflict of interest, because they own it, and the stuff goes south, and the public employees are left holding the bill. So CalPERS is like $500 million in the hole, thanks to Blum. They're still paying him $3 million a year in consulting fees. I wonder why.
Peter, talk about how Blum got rid of the university's auditor.
Oh, you mean the treasurer?
Yeah.
Yeah, the university had this treasurer for many years, 20 some odd years, Patricia, I forget her name. And she had invested in very safe bonds and blue chip corporate stocks, and was generating 15 or 20% annual return for literally decades. And when Blum came in, along with a man named Paul Wachter, who was appointed by Schwarzenegger, Paul Wachter is his main business partner for many years. They co-own a huge private equity slush fund called Dimensional Fund Advisors, which is a whole other story. When they came in, Blum became head of the investment committee with the Regents, and Wachter was on it, and I think he's the head now. They shifted the emphasis of university endowment and retirement spending, which was, like the retirement fund was like $70 billion, the endowment's about $50 billion. This is a chunk of change. They shifted it out of safe stocks into what they call alternative investments, or private equity, which we used to call junk bonds, which is what those guys do for a living. They shifted a vast amount of billions and billions of dollars out of these safe bonds and blue chip stocks. And I'm not saying that this is a good place for public money to be, is supporting fossil fuel companies and weapons manufacturers, which is what those safe investments are, but that's another story for the moment. From the point of view of the ruling class, who shoot themselves in their own foot here, because if they want to make money, the last person they should have contracted with is Richard Blum. And they shifted these investments out of the safe investments into these crappy investments, these junk bond investments, which then totally tanked, right? And who's in charge there? The regents of the University of California are a government in and of themselves, sanctioned by the state constitution of California, which basically says that they are extra legal to the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't even apply to it. So the Constitution says there's created an entity to which the Constitution doesn't apply. It is a state in and of itself, accountable only to the regents, who for 150 years have just been bankers and people with industrial business interests. There's never been, as far as I know, an educator appointed to the Regency of the University of California, or a person that wasn't tied into the political establishment and was not a financier.
Not true.
The only one is George Wythe.
Oh, okay, Dolores heard it. Maybe the occasional one. Good, a few people. The exceptions prove the rule in this case, you know. Never say never, Peter. And, you know, it's, I wrote that thing on the Regents, I call it the Investors Club. And it's not like it's new. I mean, if you look, the Los Angeles Times did a similar investigation in 1970, which said all the same stuff that I was saying, just a new cast of characters. And then you can go back in history, all the way to like the second year that the Regents were in existence. And there was a huge outcry in California. The state legislature actually had to pass a law saying that they couldn't hire their own relatives and things like that. You know, so it's just a question here. It's interesting because it's, you know, do we really want a system in which these types of people control all this public money? I mean, as I'm fond of saying, it's not even their own fault that they eat it, because it's like putting a plate of raw hamburger in front of a pack of feral cats and you expect them not to eat it? You know, the problem is that we're allowing these people to be regents. Once they're regents, the game's over. Why are they regents? Why are we allowing the University of California, which is part of the Commons, to be an entity in and of itself dominated, run for, and by bankers?
I just want to point out that the mother of one of the student regents is here, Lotus Fong in the back, and Lotus engaged one of the regents at one point and found out how much it will set you back, how much it will cost you to buy yourself a regentship from the governor in California. How much was that, Lotus?
Well, this is like 15 years ago. It was 50,000.
50,000 at that time.
But Bill Lockyer, at one of these Democratic, breakfasts, he says it's time to get rid of the country club.
Mm-hmm.
So when you see how it operates, I think the parents need to be organized. Our son tried to get us to organize a parent tuition boycott, because the parents are so worried about getting their kids in and then paying for it. They don't know how the place is run.
Yes. Thank you.
It's morphing into just like UC stuff, and this is interesting
So
because
much fun.
because at one point this man named Robert Samuels, who is I think he's a UCLA professor. You may or may not know him. He had a newsletter ranting and raving against the Regents' investment policies at the time I was writing this thing about the Regents, 2010 or whenever it was. And he spoke loud enough and firmly enough, and there was enough flack going on around my article and stuff, that they actually put him on as an advisor to the investment committee of the Regents. And that's the last time we heard from Bob Samuels. Not a peep.
Into the California Constitution that there would be a member of labor, sort of. That was the president of the Mechanics Institute in San Francisco, had a seat, an automatic seat on the Regents, but they got rid of that, I think, about 20 years ago. So the president of Mechanics, which is not really a working man's institution quite so much anymore as it was in the 19th century, is no longer on the Board of Regents.